I pulled into the driveway of the house I had bought in absolute silence. It was a mid-century modern gem tucked into the slopes of Oakwood Hills, defined by its floor-to-ceiling glass walls. Those walls were designed to let nature in. Instead, tonight they framed a horror show. Inside my living room, a room I had not even slept in yet, stood my mother, Karen, and my sister-in-law, Brianna. They were not knocking. They were not waiting patiently on the porch, respectful of the threshold of a new life. They were simply in. My mother, exhibiting the casual entitlement that had been the primary language of my childhood, was holding a hideous yellow tape measure against the window frame. She was not visiting. She was measuring for curtains. They had broken into my sanctuary before I even turned the key in the lock, violating the space I had sacrificed 6 years of my life to purchase. The violation wasn't just physical. It was an ideological assault on the concept of mine. My knuckles whitened around the steering wheel. I could feel the hot, familiar surge of adrenaline, the ancient, instinctive reaction to trespass, coiling in my gut. For 33 years, that surge had always been followed by shouting, tears, and ultimately retreat and compliance. But tonight, I was done reacting. I didn't honk. I didn't storm the front door screaming about boundaries or respect, because those words were meaningless currency in the Hartford economy. That would have been an emotional reaction, and emotions were exactly what they fed on. They wanted the confrontation. They thrived on the chaos that justified their intrusion. I shifted my car into reverse and backed out of the driveway as quietly as I had arrived, the tires crunching almost imperceptibly on the pristine gravel. I drove 2 blocks down, parking under the heavy, concealing shade of an ancient oak tree whose sprawling branches seemed to offer protection. Only then, once safely outside their sphere of influence, did I open the security app on my phone. The small screen became my window into the drama I refused to star in. I watched them like a surveillance operator observing a breach. My mother moved through the empty rooms with the unnerving confidence of an owner inspecting the finish on the floors, her hands already gesturing where furniture should go, erasing my non-existent choices. Brianna, always the eager accomplice, pointed sharply at the quartz kitchen island, her mouth moving in the familiar, judgmental rhythm of criticism I knew by heart. The color was wrong. The style was too cold. It wasn't family-friendly. The audacity was breathtaking, yet utterly predictable. They weren't seeing a home. They were seeing an asset, an empty vessel waiting to be filled with their demands. I waited in the quiet isolation of my parked car. Time wasn't measured in minutes. It was measured in the gradual, deliberate restoration of my control. The headlights of my car were off, merging me into the deep twilight shadows of Oakwood Hills. I watched their clockwork entitlement play out. They stayed for 23 minutes, 23 minutes of uninvited stewardship over my single greatest investment. Once their tail lights disappeared, swallowed by the winding, dark road, I finally drove back. Walking into my own home felt like walking into a crime scene that only I could truly see. The air felt heavy, viscous, contaminated by the palpable residue of their entitlement. I didn't cry. I didn't call them to ask how they got a key, because I knew the answer was irrelevant. Whether it was coercion, manipulation, or theft, the breach itself was the only fact that mattered. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for a 24-hour emergency locksmith. I requested commercial-grade smart locks with biometric access installed on every exterior door. Immediately. I wasn't securing a house. I was fortifying a perimeter, erecting a physical, unbreachable barrier against a lifetime of psychological invasions. The house was no longer merely a dwelling. It was a declaration of sovereignty. While I waited for the technician, who promised an arrival within the hour, I cleaned. This wasn't merely housekeeping. It was a purification ritual. I didn't just wipe surfaces. I sterilized them. I scrubbed the window frame where my mother's yellow tape measure had rested, polishing the glass until it reflected only the cold, clear moonlight. I mopped the pristine white floors where Brianna's expensive, critical heels had clicked, erasing every trace of their unauthorized footprints from the ecosystem I had just begun to build. It was an exorcism, a relentless effort to eliminate the sense of contamination. I needed to feel clean again, to feel that the air itself was scrubbed free of the heavy scent of their ownership. The locksmith arrived precisely at the 60-minute mark. He was a large man, quiet and efficient, asking few questions, sensing the high, brittle voltage in the air without needing explanation. He understood the urgency radiating from me. He didn't see a landscape architect tired from a move. He saw someone demanding security from an unseen, but clearly imminent, threat. He drilled, replaced, and programmed the hardware. The new locks were solid, imposing mechanisms of steel and electronics. Heavy front door handles that felt cold and substantial under my touch. Electronic deadbolts that required a personalized code and a fingerprint scan. The installation took nearly 2 hours, a time I spent pacing the empty rooms, watching his methodical work, listening to the grinding and buzzing that promised finality. When he finished, he handed me the master key card, a sleek piece of plastic that felt disproportionately powerful in my hand. I closed the heavy front door and engaged the electronic deadbolt. Click. That sound was the loudest thing I had heard all day, a single definitive punctuation mark after a lifetime of whispered compromises. It was mechanical, final, and perfect. It was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping on a lifetime of open-door policies, on the philosophy that my space was always inherently their space. It was the sound of a boundary finally, physically snapping shut. The exhaustion hit me then, a sudden, heavy wave, but it was a satisfying fatigue, the kind that follows a decisive victory. I didn't have furniture yet, so I sat down cross-legged in the absolute center of the vast living room floor, anchoring myself to the solid foundation I had paid for. My greyhound, Shadow, who had patiently observed the entire ordeal from a cautious distance, padded over and curled up beside me. His long, lean body a warm, comforting weight against my leg. The room was empty, yet full. There was no furniture, no art on the walls, just the intense moonlight filtering through the expansive glass walls. Walls I had paid for with 6 years of missed holidays, brutal freelance contracts, and a monotonous diet of instant noodles. There is a specific, profound texture to the silence of a room that you own completely. It doesn't hum with the anxiety of a landlord's unexpected inspection or the sharp, grating friction of a roommate's demanding schedule. It is a vacuum, a truly neutral space. It contains only what you invited in, the soft, even breathing of my dog, the quiet hum of the new refrigerator starting up in the kitchen, and my own steady pulse. No noise, no demands, no history, just the silence I had painstakingly purchased. Tasted like cold, clear water after a marathon run. I leaned my head back against the wall, absorbing the profound, isolating peace. They thought this house was merely a family asset, another resource to be shared and exploited. Tonight, behind this new, unforgiving steel bolt, I was correcting the ledger. I had exchanged my compliance for my sanity, and the exchange rate was excellent. People often ask why I had to keep a $680,000 asset a secret. They ask, with genuine, bewildered innocence, why I couldn't simply tell my parents I was moving out. They don't understand the complex, predatory economics of the Hartford family system. In my family, assets were not owned by individuals. They were collective resources to be perpetually harvested and reallocated to the person with the loudest, most pressing needs. And for 33 years, that person was invariably my brother, Brandon. Brandon was what my mother proudly called a visionary, and what the banks more accurately called a high-risk liability. He was a tech entrepreneur, which in his reality meant he had great hair, a disarmingly persuasive smile, and a long, staggering history of businesses that evaporated into thin air before delivering a single product. He didn't build things. He pitched them, expertly selling the dream of future wealth that never materialized. I was his polar opposite. I was a landscape architect, a practitioner of the brutally empirical world. I dealt in soil drainage, root systems, concrete hardscapes, and the unforgiving certainty of gravity and physics. If a retaining wall wasn't built correctly, the earth moved, sometimes violently. There was no talking your way out of a mudslide, no pitching your way past a structural collapse. While Brandon was perpetually networking in Aspen or pitching vaporware concepts in high-rise Miami penthouses, I was on job sites at 6 o'clock in the morning, wearing steel-toed boots, ensuring the foundation of every project held true. We were assigned our archetypes early, etched in stone by my mother's narrative. Brandon was the star, the genius destined for glory, and I was the stagehand, the reliable infrastructure. When Brandon, at 16, totaled his second car after a late-night party, my parents immediately bought him a shiny, newer one so his image wouldn't suffer among his peers. When I needed a functional laptop for college, I was given a lengthy, sanctimonious lecture on the virtue of self-reliance and the necessity of part-time work. The work, ironically, was the key to my freedom. I didn't resent the labor. The constant grinding made me sharp, focused, and ultimately dangerous to their system. Over the last 6 years, I had taken every high-end commission I could secure. I designed minimalist Zen gardens for ridiculously wealthy tech CEOs, sustainable green terraces for luxury hotels, and complex, multi-level hardscapes for commercial properties. I didn't take vacations, I drove the same reliable, boring sedan, and I certainly didn't buy designer clothes. Every single cent of surplus capital was funneled directly into a high-yield savings account that my mother was utterly unaware of, growing silently, exponentially, until it totaled $120,000. My untouchable war chest. Meanwhile, Brandon was burning through family capital like jet fuel. He always had cash flow issues. He received bridge loans from my father that invariably never found the other side of the river. I watched, aghast, as my parents refinanced their own modest home, twice, to fund his increasingly desperate seed rounds. They didn't see it as enabling a lifetime of failure. They saw it as investing in the family legacy, an obligation to the golden future Brandon promised. That was the insidious trap. In their eyes, my success was never truly mine. It was a convenient surplus. If I had money, it meant the family had money, which meant Brandon had a safety net large enough to catch his inevitable, spectacular falls. If I had bought this house openly, proudly announcing my success, it wouldn't have been my home. It would have instantaneously become the Hartford guest house, the perfect, high-visibility landing pad for Brandon when his latest venture, whatever its name, inevitably and humiliatingly crashed. I looked around my silent living room again. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls didn't just offer a beautiful view of the oak trees. They offered absolute clarity. This house wasn't just property. It was a strategically placed firewall, a physical manifestation of my refusal to participate anymore. I had bought it to prove, empirically and undeniably, that I existed outside of their gravitational ecosystem. I wasn't the utility player anymore. I was the architect of my own life, and I was definitively finished building safety nets for people who fundamentally refused to learn how to fall. The next morning, the sun hit the expansive glass walls at a perfect, glorious 45-degree angle, illuminating the thousands of microscopic dust motes dancing in the empty, sterilized space. I stood in the kitchen, nursing a mug of black coffee, watching the light fracture and spill across the quartz countertops I had chosen. For a fleeting, exquisite moment, it felt like the pure, unadulterated peace I had paid for. The silence was deep, but fragile. Then, my phone vibrated, a sudden, jarring sound against the smooth, cold surface of the quartz. It wasn't an apology. In the Hartford family, apologies were considered signs of catastrophic weakness, like finding a structural crack running through the foundation of the house. They simply didn't exist. It was a text message from my mother, Karen. The message was concise, casual, and utterly devastating in its entitlement. So glad we finally saw the investment property. It has great bones, though the glass is a bit exposed. Brianna thinks the lower suite is perfect for Brandon's soft landing. While he pivots, we can move his boxes in Saturday. Let's discuss rent. We're thinking family rate is fair since you're building equity. I stared at the screen, the steam from my coffee rising and blurring the edges of the message. I didn't feel anger, which was my usual reaction. I felt the cold, detached fascination of a scientist observing a particularly virulent new strain of virus. She didn't see a break-in. She saw a site visit. She didn't see my hard-won sole primary residence. She saw a family asset that I was temporarily holding, like a shell corporation, on behalf of the collective. This was the architecture of a narcissistic family system distilled into 7 perfect sentences. I had studied this blueprint for years in therapy, recognizing every load-bearing lie and load-shifting deflection. In my mother's mind, we were not separate individuals with distinct boundaries and property rights. We were organs in the same body. If the hand me picks an apple, the house, the mouth Brandon, has the natural inherent right to eat it. The hand does not get to hoard the apple because that would not only be selfish, it would be a dangerous malfunction of the system. That would be cancer. To Karen, my bank account was nothing more than an inconveniently located reservoir for the family trust. And right now, Brandon was experiencing a critical, career-threatening drought. She had convinced herself, with zero evidence, that I had purchased this massive, $680,000 home specifically and primarily to solve the problem of Brandon's latest, most embarrassing financial failure. In her reality, I was the property manager, she was the CEO, and Brandon was the irreplaceable talent. The violation continued when the phone buzzed with a voicemail notification that had come in immediately after the text. I listened, forcing myself to remain still. It was Karen again, her voice dropping to that recognizable, oily, conspiratorial whisper she deployed when she was planning a decisive coup. "Alyssa, darling, don't be dramatic about the key. We needed to measure because Brandon's lease is unexpectedly up on the 1st, and he's going through a very hard time with the business pivoting. He needs a place that projects success, sweetie. This house is perfect for his image. We're all pitching in, you see. You provide the housing, we'll handle his groceries and the basic expenses. It's a family trust effort. A family trust effort." The phrase was a masterpiece of gaslighting, a linguistic camouflage for unilateral decision-making. There was no trust involved. There was only my savings, my excellent credit score, and my signature alone on the deed. But to them, my autonomy was an act of aggression. By locking the door, I wasn't merely securing my property. I was stealing from the collective good, committing a crime against the family legacy. They had to escalate because my independent actions threatened the integrity of their entire, carefully constructed world. I typed a reply, forcing myself to follow the rules of engagement I had learned the hard way. Be brief, be final, and refuse to justify. I didn't explain that Brandon's image was the very thing that made him a constant liability. I refused to assure her that this was not an investment property. That was their delusion, not my fact. My response was a surgical strike. This is not an investment property. This is my primary residence. Brandon is not moving in. Do not come back to this address. The response was immediate, almost simultaneous. The 3 dots bounced on the screen like an erratic, panicking heartbeat. The ensuing message lacked the previous veneer of corporate pleasantness. It was pure, unvarnished narcissistic rage. "You are hoarding assets while your brother is drowning. I didn't raise you to be selfish. We are coming Saturday to move him in. Unlock the door or we will have a locksmith do it for us. It's family property. Alyssa." I set the phone down gently on the counter. The morning light, which moments ago had felt warm and golden, suddenly looked cold, sterile, and indifferent. This message was the confirmation I needed. They weren't going to stop. They truly and deeply believed they owned me, and by extension, they owned the deed, the locks, and the very foundation beneath my feet. My simple text messages weren't enough. My new commercial-grade locks, while comforting, weren't enough. They were operating under the inviolable, ancient laws of the Hartford family, where the golden child eats and the scapegoat starves, and any attempt to change the rules was met with total war. I needed to drag them out of their toxic, self-created jurisdiction entirely and into a space where their manipulative currency held no value. I needed to stop acting like a daughter trying to set a boundary and start acting like a determined landlord facing a hostile takeover and illegal eviction. I walked away from the volatile electronic conversation, moving toward my drafting table. Usually, this is where I sketched grade changes, intricate drainage solutions, and the placement of monumental hardscapes, problem solvable by objective mathematics and engineering. Today, I was designing an exit strategy for my entire identity. I pulled up the contact for a property attorney I had worked with last year on a complex, nasty zoning dispute. He was expensive, precise, and entirely beautifully unconcerned with the concept of family harmony. I needed professionalism, not empathy. "I need a formal notice against trespass drafted immediately," I told him, keeping my voice steady and low, utterly devoid of emotion, "and a cease and desist regarding harassment via electronic communication. I want them served by a process server. I want it to be humiliatingly official, paper in hand, witnessed, undeniable." He didn't ask why I was doing this to my mother and brother. He only asked for names and addresses, treating them as abstract parties in a civil dispute. I gave him Karen's, Brandon's, and my father Gary's addresses. Giving those names felt like cutting a heavy, rotten tether. For 29 years, my loyalty to them had been the primary, unseen structural load of my life. I had reinforced their egos, patched their financial cracks, and waterproofed their endless disasters. Now, I was making the deliberate choice to watch it all collapse. I sat back, waiting for the draft to hit my inbox, pulling out a fresh legal pad. I needed to do a different kind of math now. In economics, there is a concept called opportunity cost, the loss of potential gain from other alternatives when one alternative is chosen. For too long, I had chosen loyalty, and it was time to calculate the true compounding cost of that choice. The cost was not just the money I'd lent Brandon that evaporated into business expenses. It was the compounding interest of my own erasure, the things I lost by continuously being their emotional support system. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community, especially if you've ever had to calculate your own opportunity cost of staying too long in a toxic situation. When did you realize that the price of freedom was finally cheaper than the price of compliance? Asterisk asterisk. I began writing down the devastating ledger of my personal opportunity cost. The list was extensive and sobering. Cost: 3 years of intense, expensive therapy to unlearn the core, debilitating belief that I was inherently selfish for having needs separate from the family's demands. Cost: the chronic anxiety that manifested as severe panic attacks in the bathroom at Thanksgiving because I couldn't fix the turkey fast enough to prevent a family argument. Cost: the genuine, loving relationships I had sabotaged because I literally did not know how to let someone love me without subconsciously waiting for them to charge me an emotional fee or assign me a task. Cost: the profound silence of my young adulthood, the endless hours I spent consciously making myself smaller, quieter, and less ambitious so that Brandon could have more room, more spotlight, more capital. I looked at the finished list, filling 2 pages of the legal pad. I had been paying an exorbitant subscription fee for a love that demonstrably didn't exist. I had treated their approval as a rare, luxury asset that I had to finance with my sanity and my savings, when in reality, it was a rapidly depreciating liability that threatened to bankrupt me entirely. The only currency they truly accepted was my self-sacrifice, and I was finished paying. The logical conclusion was unavoidable. The price of my absolute freedom was their total, furious, and permanent disapproval. Looking at the emotional balance sheet, it was overwhelmingly clear. Cutting them off was the bargain of a lifetime. It felt like signing a promissory note for my future self, payable in peace. Just then, the printer whirred to life, spitting out the legal documents the attorney had emailed. The language was cold, sterile, and, in its absolute objectivity, breathtakingly beautiful. You are hereby notified that you are forbidden from entering the premises located at my address. Any attempt to do so will be met with full civil and criminal prosecution. It was perfect. It stripped away the loaded titles of mom and brother. It reduced them to what they were in this interaction: individuals threatening my peace and violating my property rights. I walked over to the desk and signed the bottom of the page, the pen scratching against the heavy legal paper. A sharp, definitive sound. I wasn't just signing a notice. I was signing a declaration of independence, formalized and certified by the jurisdiction they couldn't control. I slid the papers carefully into a large, sturdy manila envelope. I felt a strange, thrilling lightness in my chest, the feeling of heavy, unnecessary ballast being cut loose from a struggling ship. I wasn't designing a garden today. I was designing a fortress built on the bedrock of the law. I was just printing the process server's address labels for the 3 certified letters when my phone rang. It was an international number, flickering across the screen. I almost ignored it, but something compelled me to answer. It was my younger sister, Megan, who had escaped the family gravity years ago and lived overseas. "Alyssa, I need you to listen to me very carefully right now." Her voice was tight, thin, and the connection crackled with distance and static. "I just got off the phone with Dad. He was drunk, really drunk. He told me something." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, sensing the impending disaster. "Megan, I'm in the middle of... They sold the cabin." The 3 words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I froze instantly, the manila envelope slipping slightly in my numb fingers. The cabin was a small, rustic A-frame structure tucked deep in the mountains, built decades ago by my grandfather's own hands. It wasn't worth millions, but it was the one asset my parents had always solemnly promised was mine. It was my designated inheritance, the single piece of property meant to balance the scales against the endless financial investment poured into Brandon's black hole of failure. "What do you mean they sold it?" My voice was hollow, barely a whisper. They sold it 6 months ago, Alyssa. Brandon got into some new crypto scheme, something called Lunatra or whatever. He lost everything. He was leveraged for $250,000. They sold the cabin immediately to cover his margin calls and keep him out of real trouble. The room began to spin slightly, and I grabbed the sharp edge of the drafting table to steady myself, the immediate shock turning into a searing, white-hot clarity. $250,000. My designated inheritance, my past, my single guaranteed foothold in the world of family assets, liquidated for Brandon's gambling addiction. Why didn't they tell me? I asked the question rhetorical, already knowing the terrifying answer. Because they needed a place to put him. Alyssa, Megan said, her voice shaking with a cold, distant rage that matched my own. Dad said the plan was always to move him into your new house. Quietly. So they wouldn't have to admit to the country club crowd that he's utterly broke. They were going to tell everyone he bought a new place in exclusive Oakwood Hills. They were going to use your successful, expensive house to completely launder his damaged reputation and pretend the sale of the cabin never happened. Your home was the cover-up. I hung up the phone without another word. The silence in the room was fundamentally different now. It wasn't the peaceful vacuum I had enjoyed earlier. It was vibrating with a terrifying, low-frequency intensity. This wasn't merely entitlement, a predictable family squabble over space. This was calculated financial theft, followed by an aggressive attempt to seize my personal property to hide the evidence of their crime. They had liquidated my future inheritance to bail out the golden child from a self-inflicted disaster, and then tried to commandeer my hard-won sanctuary to maintain the lie. They weren't just bad parents or entitled relatives. They were co-conspirators in a financial crime against my future. The realization crystallized instantly. The notice against trespass, currently sitting on my desk, suddenly felt ridiculously insufficient. It was a fly swatter when I needed a heavy, precise sledgehammer. My strategic goals had instantly shifted from defense to comprehensive, scorched earth discovery. I picked up my phone, my hand remarkably steady, and called the attorney back, getting him on the line immediately. Add a paragraph, I said, my voice terrifyingly calm, the professional tone masking the internal volcanic eruption. I want a formal inquiry into the status of the Mountain View Cabin Trust, and I want a forensic accounting of all family assets I am listed as a beneficiary on, effective immediately. I paused, letting the implication sink in. If they sold that cabin without my legally required signature on the trust release, that's not just a boundary violation. That is financial fraud. There was a moment of heavy silence on the line. That's a declaration of war, Alyssa. The lawyer warned, his voice grave. He knew the gravity of escalating from a petty trespass notice to formal accusations of financial malfeasance against one's own parents. No, I corrected him, my gaze sweeping across the glass walls toward the setting sun. It's a discovery phase. If they are willing to steal my inheritance to protect him, I am no longer willing to trust that any family arrangement they set up was legal or ethical. I want to know everything. I looked out the glass walls as the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the freshly installed lawn. They had taken my past. They had sold my designated memories to pay for Brandon's addiction to high-stakes gambling. But they were not, under any circumstances, going to take my future. I wasn't just locking them out of the house anymore. I was about to burn the bridge while they were still standing on it, ensuring there would be no way back to me, or to my financial resources ever again. The confrontation set for Saturday morning was no longer about a misplaced key or a few curtains. It was about exposing the rot at the center of the Hartford family system. The wait for Saturday was agonizingly long, yet simultaneously swift. I spent the intervening days meticulously preparing for the confrontation, not by pacing nervously, but by focusing on the precise, objective details of my strategy. I reviewed the formal notice against trespass documents repeatedly, ensuring every name, every legal term, and every threat of prosecution was correct and binding. The attorney confirmed the process server had successfully delivered the papers to all three named parties, Karen, Gary, and Brandon, ensuring they could not later claim ignorance of my explicit instruction to stay away. I knew this move would enrage them beyond measure. Narcissists do not simply accept boundaries. They view them as tests of will, daring you to enforce them. They believed, truly and deeply, that if they simply showed up on Saturday morning with enough physical momentum, enough sheer force of will, and a large moving truck, I would crumble. They were betting on my ingrained shame, betting that I would rather be compliant and emotionally abused than cause a public scene in my quiet, upscale neighborhood. They were betting on the daughter they thought they had raised. They were wrong. I wasn't afraid of a scene. In fact, I had curated one, setting the stage with the calculated precision of a hardscape architect preparing for a major installation. The morning air on Saturday was crisp and cool. I was standing in the kitchen, not pacing, but calmly drinking a cup of perfectly brewed tea, watching the driveway from behind the enormous glass walls. I saw the first sign of their approach precisely at 9 a.m., the time Karen had unilaterally declared they would be arriving. It wasn't the discreet sedan I was expecting first. It was the low, aggressive grinding rumble of a large diesel engine, a massive 26-foot moving truck, clearly rented for a full-scale operation, backed slowly into my pristine driveway, its air brakes hissing loudly like a warning serpent. This was not a soft landing. This was an invasion. Brandon jumped out of the passenger side first. He was wearing pristine, designer sunglasses, the image maintenance was still paramount, and immediately began shouting arrogant, unnecessary directions to the truck driver, acting the part of the successful homeowner he was desperately pretending to be. My mother, Karen, pulled up right behind the truck in her luxury sedan, and her trunk popped open automatically, likely filled not just with groceries for the pantry she felt entitled to stock, but with small, symbolic items meant to establish immediate domestic control. They moved with the arrogant, sickening efficiency of people who have never once been told no in a way that mattered. Brandon marched up the driveway, his hand already reaching for the front door handle. He fully expected it to open instantly. He expected me to be cowering inside, ready to accept my preassigned role as his perpetual safety net. Instead of letting him touch the new smart lock, I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch myself. I made sure to pull the heavy door firmly shut behind me, the new electronic deadbolt engaging with that final, definitive click. Locking me out, but locking them out more importantly. I wasn't wearing pajamas or a panicked expression. I was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, standing tall on the porch, holding the certified manila envelope containing the legal documents. "Open the garage, Alyssa," Brandon shouted, dismissing my presence entirely, already irritated by the delay. "The driver is on an hourly rate." His voice was clipped with the urgency of his self-importance. "You need to move the truck," I said, my voice steady, conversational, and surprisingly low. It didn't need to be loud. The acoustics of the glass and stone amplified everything, carrying the quiet command across the driveway. Karen, her face set in a tight, angry smile that failed to reach her eyes, marched rapidly up the steps. "We are absolutely not doing this today, Alyssa. We are moving your brother in. We sold the cabin, your inheritance, to fix his mess, and you are going to do your part. Now, unlock the door before the neighbors start looking at this pathetic scene." The neighbors are already looking, I thought, a cold satisfaction washing over me. I pointed calmly toward the street, ensuring my gaze didn't break contact with Karen's furious eyes. 2 patrol cars had just pulled up to the curb, their lights flashing silently. A muted, professional blue and red warning against the bright morning sun. I had called the non-emergency line an hour ago, precisely at 8 a.m., reporting an anticipated trespassing incident involving aggressive family members who had already attempted to illegally enter the premises. I had specifically requested a standby presence to keep the peace and document any attempt at forced entry or harassment. The moment I pointed, the officers began their slow, deliberate walk up the driveway. Brandon froze mid-gesture, his attempt to appear like a successful entrepreneur instantly dissolving. His mask of confidence slipped, revealing the terrified, petulant child beneath, the one who was accustomed to being insulated from the consequences of his own actions. Karen looked from the approaching police to me, her eyes widening, genuinely shocked. She couldn't process this reality. In her world, you simply did not call the police on family, no matter the offense. In her world, you let them loot you, you sacrificed your assets, and you maintained the facade of familial perfection at all costs. The lead officer, a tall, professional woman, approached me first. "Ma'am, we are here regarding the anticipated disturbance. May I see the notice?" she requested calmly. "Officer," I said, stepping forward with deliberate, measured grace, the sun catching the professional sheen of my suit. These individuals, Karen Hartford and Brandon Hartford, have been personally served with a formal notice against trespass. They are currently attempting to force entry into my primary residence under the pretense of moving belongings into a property they do not own. I handed her the certified documents, along with a copy of the deed, which clearly listed me, and only me, as the sole owner. She scanned the deed, then the legal warning, her expression remaining perfectly neutral. She then looked directly at Brandon. "Is this your property, sir?" the officer asked, her voice firm and non-negotiable. Brandon stammered, his persuasive smile failing utterly. "It's family property. My sister bought it for the family. She's just being dramatic. The deed is in her name only." The officer cut him off, her finger tapping the document. "And this notice, which you were legally served with, clearly states you are forbidden from being here. You need to immediately remove this truck and yourselves from this address, or you will be cited and arrested for trespassing." The silence that followed was heavy, thick, and utterly delicious. Brandon looked frantically at Karen, waiting for her to step in, to deploy her CEO authority, waiting for her to explain to the officer that he was special, that the rules didn't apply to the golden child. But Karen was staring only at me. She saw the new locks, the professional suit, the certified legal papers, and the police standing ready. She saw for the first time that I wasn't her daughter anymore. I was a stranger, an adversary who knew her most damning secrets and was willing to use the full force of the law to defend herself. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted. It had evaporated into the cold morning air. They had no leverage. They had no cabin. And now they had no landing pad. "Alyssa, please," Karen hissed, taking a frantic, desperate step toward me, her voice trembling, stripped bare of its usual authoritative polish. "Don't do this to your brother. Don't cause this irreversible damage to the family." She was appealing to the ancient, corrupted sense of obligation that she had always relied upon, the demand for silence and compliance. "I didn't do anything," I replied, my voice calm, the truth slicing through her panic like glass. "I just bought a house. You sold the cabin. You made your choices, Karen. Now you must live with the consequences of liquidating my inheritance." I used her first name, a deliberate, powerful breach of filial respect that signaled the absolute end of our relationship. The officer stepped closer to the startled truck driver, who was leaning against his massive vehicle, utterly confused by the domestic warfare unfolding before him. "Back it out now, sir." Immediately, the sound of the truck's reverse alarm, beep beep beep, echoed through the quiet neighborhood. It was not just the sound of a vehicle reversing. It was the sound of a full, humiliating retreat. It was the sound of their delusion backing out of my reality, taking their parasitic demands with them. I stood on my porch, rooted to the spot, watching them scramble into their vehicles. Brandon, still fiddling awkwardly with his designer sunglasses, jumped into the truck's cab to get out of sight. Karen climbed into her sedan, her face a mask of shocked fury, utterly humiliated by the public, official nature of her defeat. The police officers stayed until the moving truck and Karen's sedan had both disappeared around the winding corner, ensuring the perimeter was secure. When the officers left, offering a final nod of professional respect, the silence that returned to Oakwood Hills was deeper and more profound than any silence I had experienced before. Before, it was a fragile thing, something I was desperately trying to hide inside the house. Now it was fortified. It was the silence of a siege that had been decisively broken, replaced by the humming stability of absolute control. The physical confrontation had lasted less than 10 minutes, but the psychological impact was final. They had arrived with the intention of colonization. They left having been formally evicted by the rule of law. My fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce certainty that I would never allow them to trespass again, either physically or emotionally, into the sacred space of my self-made life. I walked back inside, re-engaging the biometric lock. The house was mine entirely and without condition. The battle was over, but the war of consequences was just beginning for them.